Unless you're asking a question or making a comment, please keep yourself muted. Well, welcome everybody to the Agnostics group in Melbourne, Australia. I'm David Miller. I'm the convener of the Agnostics group. I'll just read out our blurb. Agnosticism, theism, and atheism. Agnosticism is about knowledge. An agnostic takes the position that they don't know if any gods exist or not, perhaps that they cannot know if any gods exist or not, and in some cases that no human being can possibly know if any gods exist or not. Saying I don't know can indeed be a reasonable answer to the question of what one knows. But neither atheism nor theism address the question of what one knows. They address the question of what one believes. Theists believe in the existence of at least one God of some sort, and atheists don't. That's it. That's all there is to mere theism and mere atheism. However, both atheists and theists may be agnostics as well. Whether one believes or disbelieves, one may do so in the context of not claiming to know one way or the other. Therefore, you can be an atheist agnostic, and, for example, you can be a Christian agnostic. Well, today's speaker is Tim Jackson, who I will leave to introduce himself if he wishes. And his topic is the secular anti-theism of Max Stirner.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I'm happy to have this opportunity to speak here and share the things that I'm most passionate about. 2 years ago, near the end of the pandemic, I started a reading group that I've since then have been hosting. I've created a space where people can come together and speak and discuss the theorist and writer Max Stirner. We would be and every Wednesday we meet and have a live reading and discussion of Max Stirner for about 2 hours. And so I've had lots of hours talking about Max Stirner, and this has clearly proven to be something that I'm very passionate to discuss. With that, I'm going to share my screen, and then we can take a look in the PowerPoint presentation that I've shared. Feel free to leave comments in the comment section. I'll do my best to read them. However, if you have verbal comments you'd like to share, please wait for that afterwards, after I'm done with my presentation. Let me share my screen, go into the slideshow mode. So my presentation is on the secular anti-theism of Max Stirner, an introduction to his life, work, and legacy. I will do my best to represent his biography, his major writing, Unique in His Property, and what follows after. And so let's get into it. First, we start with a quote from Albert Camus. I'm going to be primarily looking at Stirner from an existentialist point of view during this presentation. And here we can read Camus saying, quote, "Even before Nietzsche, Stirner wanted to eradicate the very idea of God from man's mind after he had destroyed God himself." Then we can find that in his work, The Rebel. Furthermore, Martin Buber says, quote, "As Protagoras leads towards his contemporary Socrates, Stirner leads towards his contemporary Kierkegaard," end quote. That's in his book, Between Man and Man. Who is Max Stirner, and what leads him to have this characterization, someone who prefigures both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche? Perhaps in the discussion that we have today, we can see the similarities and perhaps the contrasting points of view that these figures can see within Stirner and those who are mainly understood as existentialist thinkers or absurdist thinkers. The first thing that should be said is that Stirner's is in fact a metonym, a nickname given to him later in his life. His birth name was in fact Johann Caspar Schmidt, and he was born in 1806 in Bayreuth, Germany. 1806 is a time of social and political turmoil in which was then Prussia. 1806 is when Napoleon would invade Prussia, and it is when the Holy Roman Empire would dissolve. It is also famously when Hegel would send his notes to the publisher during the war flames, not knowing whether it would be published or not. Shortly after Stirner's birth, his biological father died, leaving his mother to look, leaving him in, you could say, difficult times growing up. But soon his mother would remarry, and likely due to the war, they would all move to Kolm, to the countryside, where his now a stepfather, I believe, worked. And so at the age of 12, he would return to Bayreuth, his hometown, and stay with his aunts and uncles to likely attend the prestigious school there. Here we have a more modern day picture of the home that Stirner, the street that Stirner lived on. I'll go back. It's on the left here. There's a little garden in the front, and it's the 3-story home on the left there. If we go to the more modern day street view, we can see that the house to the right still exists with its pillar, but his home no longer exists. However, that is still nonetheless the same street. Stirner, before high school, would study Latin, French, and would be quite proficient within Latin and French. We are not sure how Stirner became first in contact with Hegelian philosophy, but we do know that his you could say the headmaster at his school was a known supporter of Hegel. That's one theory that was offered in the biography, and the one and only biography of Stirner. In 1806, at the age of 20, he would take almost all the classes that Hegel had to offer. Strangely, however, not Hegel's most frequent class that he taught, known as logic. He would take his classes on the philosophy of spirit, the philosophy of religion, philosophy of history, aesthetics, and so on. And he would also take from the other well-known Hegelian thinker, Mahanneke, along, I believe, also Schleiermacher, and several others. He did this to study philology, hoping to become a teacher. However, after 2 years, due to family affairs, likely due to his mother's failing mental health, he would withdraw and be one who would take this opportunity to travel around Germany, but not too far from his home. It is also should be said that in 1831, I believe, Hegel died, and this would introduce a split that we will see that we will see further in this presentation. After this, in 1832, he would reapply to Berlin, and furthermore, in 1834, applied for a teaching credential examination, which would be postponed until 1835 due to, I believe, an illness that he had contracted. Unfortunately, he was given a conditional pass. He was given a qualified faculties docenti, which would hamper Stirner's ability to find a teaching job. He would fulfill his pedagogical trial year teaching Latin. And in fact, the only reason that we know of Stirner's early life is because of a minor essay that he had written for his credential examination in Latin to demonstrate his Latin proficiency. This, it should be noted that Stirner would receive a degree, and he would never teach at a state gymnasium as he had hoped. So here we on the right, we have a stat sheet. How do I say? A picture of the University of Berlin and the front page. We have a garden in the front, and we have another image. Hopefully that'll be from the side view of the street they're from. Here we have the most historically accurate picture of Max Stirner. This is actually drawn by, I'm getting ahead of myself, but we will get to that. In 1836, Schmidt's mother would go into a private insane asylum, and in 1837, in fact, most of his remaining family would die, and so any inheritance that Stirner would have received would have gone to his mother. His biological father died, his aunt, his uncle, and many of his, even some of his cousins. In 1836, he would be married. However, his first marriage would die with his wife, I think, during childbirth. In 1837, Stirner would become a teacher at a private secondary girls' school, teaching German and history for 5 years until abruptly he would resign in 1844. We will see why coming up. It is during this time that we get Stirner's nickname, Stern coming from the forehead, because the way Stirner parted his hair, but also because biologically he had a large forehead. This can also be perhaps translated as high brow, but this name was given to his students since he was described afterwards from them as constantly polite, calm-natured, and readily helpful and sensitive. And had good relations with the faculty at the school he was teaching as well. This will soon be seen as ironic the further we go in our presentation. One thing that should be noted in recent scholarship is that Stirner would return to Berlin to likely take a class. This class would be Karl Werder's winter course on Hegel's logic, the one course that Stirner did not take from Hegel. And we know and this would be a class that would be attended by Engels, it'd be attended by Kierkegaard. We know that Kierkegaard went to Berlin in 1841 to study with Schleiermacher, but we also know that from his notebooks, from Notebook 8, that he also attended Karl Werder's class on Hegel. Bakunin was also in this class, and so also Stirner, given letters that Engels had written. This would be on Werder's new book, Logik als Kommata und I'm losing my German, but nonetheless, it is a commentary and exposition of Hegel's science of logic. And this is where we can see perhaps some idiosyncrasies between Werder and Hegel. Werder would argue against Hegel that the fundamental grounds of Hegel's logic begins within absolute negation, within nothingness. And this we can see within Stirner's writings and perhaps also Kierkegaard. Not to mention also Bakunin. The emphasis that Werder would place upon negation would be instrumental to these thinkers here. And here on the right, we can see a screenshot of that very book. This is from the Hegelian scholar Steplovich. In 1835, 4 years after the death of Hegel, the political and social ramifications of Hegelian thought were beginning to divide. One would be in support of the monarchy and the support of the state and likely the status quo. This will be coming from a quote of Hegel's and saying that what is real is rational. This gave rationalization to the current existing German state, which I believe was an absolute monarchy until after the 1848 revolutions. And so on one hand, you had these old, what is known as the old Hegelians, which would be in favor of the monarchy, would be in favor of religion and the status quo. And in 1835, this would come into attack by a person known as David Strauss. He published a book known as The Life of Jesus, which would use Hegelian philosophy to demonstrate that that the story of Jesus Christ is likely a myth. And the person who was chosen to defend the old Hegelians, the conservative Hegelians, to say that actually, in fact, the Hegelian philosophy can demonstrate the actuality of Jesus Christ, was Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer was an upcoming teacher, and he was far younger than most of the faculty. But at this moment, this is where Bruno Bauer would, in fact, become more radical than David Strauss and demonstrate that if that Hegelian philosophy is more fundamental than Christianity, if it is through Hegelian philosophy that we are to demonstrate the actuality of Christ. However, Bruno Bauer would go even so far to say that the entirety of Jesus Christ and Christianity is, the entirety of Jesus Christ is a myth. This would result in a group of people coming together loosely related to or in reaction against the conservative old Hegelians. They would be in favor of largely being anti-monarchical and being anti-religion. And so many, because of their anti-monarchy, would be, for example, Republicans, or would become early burgeoning socialists. Others in their anti-religion attitudes would embrace atheist humanism, as we will see with Feuerbach. And this would take place in a wine bar, I believe, and did not just feature philosophers, but also feature journalists, publishers, comedians, writers, and many of those who were on the most radical of Berlin. Notable attendees include Bruno Bauer, Ludwig Feuerbach, Max Stirner, Arnold Ruge, Friedrich Engels, and Karl Marx. However, Karl Marx would leave by 1841, when this was known as the Doctors' Club, and likely never met Max Stirner. It is also likely that Stirner came after 1841. And here we have a sketch of Die Freien, the free ones, at Hippel's wine bar in 1842 by Friedrich Engels. Here we can, and in fact, this is the very image that we have the most historical representation of Max Stirner. And I've done a celebrity of pointing out the figures here that perhaps are most relevant to the discussion I'm going to have today. One person I want to point out is not just Bruno Bauer, but Otto Wiggen to the right of Bruno Bauer, who would publish Friedrich Engels' work known as the Conditions of the Working Class in England, and also do much of the printing of the first edition of Das Kapital. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. Engels also wrote a poem about Stirner in his article Des Triumph des Glaubens. And I'll quote it at length, quote, "Look at Stirner, look at him, the peaceful enemy of all constraint. For now he's drinking beer, soon he'll drink blood like water." As others cry savagely, "Down with kings." Immediately Stirner adds, "Down with laws also." Stirner, full of dignity, proclaims, "Who binds their will? Who here wants to force a law on us by shouting? You all bind your will and dare to call yourselves free. How you've all grown accustomed to slavery. Away with dogma, away with rules. Away with rule. Look at Stirner, how he throws down whole bales of books that the pious, stunned, collapse in droves." This leads to perhaps a dualistic, how do I say, a contradiction, because on one hand, Stirner is this teacher at a secondary girls' school, known as very calm, very collected, very caring, and yet he is known within this most radical clubs as someone who is the most radical. And this certainly reflects in his writings as well. But his persona within the free can be described much the same way. He was the quiet person, someone who didn't speak too loud. And when he opened his mouth, his friends would realize perhaps just how crazy he was. And during these moments, he would stir great debate when he did. And the other thing I want to mention is that a part of the germ, how to say, I bring up this meme because in part there is a significant meme culture today in regard to Max Stirner, and perhaps can be used to exemplify some of the points I have here today. There are two major essays that are popular in regard to Max Stirner, although he did write a lot more. Most of his written works can be, I believe, traced to 1841, but we do have an essay that he wrote for his school credential examination, and of course his biography, his mini biography that he gave. The first inklings of the work that we can see in his later life, however, I believe, comes during, I believe, after he comes into contact with Friedrich Engels, and those are most radical. He would become a correspondent for the Rheinische Zeitung, and in 1842, before Marx would edit it later that year, Stirner would write two essays. The first would be known as The False Principle of Our Education, and this would be a critique of the two major, how to say, pedagogies of his day, one being humanism, one being realism. In regard to both, Stirner saw the former as merely subjecting them to the past, and in regard to the latter, saw I believe realism as subjecting the person to the present. Stirner, however, wanted to focus on an education that empowered the individual's self-willing and empowered their own self-determination. In this regard, Stirner coined this specific approach known as personalism. He did another essay known as Art and Religion, in which he would be more critical and more radical than Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer, who argued that art is close to philosophy. Stirner would argue against this and say, in fact, philosophy only concerns itself with itself. And this is where we can see an inkling of an understanding of alienated objectivity, in which art creates an object for religion, and this object becomes symbolized and externalized from the individual, from which that symbol becomes an ideal that the individual must live after. And this disunion between the individual and this object, Stirner sees as celebrated within religion, and the means of perhaps doing away with this disunity to unite the person and their object, to do away with this alienation, Stirner sees as potentials within comedy, for example, or within creative expression. This leads us to his work. I believe after these essays, Stirner would begin telling his friends that he was working on a work that comprised the totality of his thoughts. And some thought that he didn't even have this work to begin with, but his work would be known, perhaps best known as the unique in its property. However, and this translation was this title is from a 2017 translation of Max Stirner's work, which previously in the Anglophone world was understood as the ego and its property. The thing we should say about this is that it was published in October 1844, and if you look, you might sometimes see that it erroneously said that it was 1845. This is wrong. This is incorrect, because they changed the date hoping to avoid censorship, because during this time there was great concern for voices that were critical of the monarchy and critical of the state and religion, and the reactionary government saw particularly Hegelian philosophy as after David Strauss's The Life of Jesus as a threat to their institutions, and in fact many of their discussions of the free were attended by informants. Nonetheless, it was published in 1844, not 1845, and it concerns the question of the alienation of an individual from themselves. The one thing that should be said is that this impressively uses Hegelian philosophy to deconstruct Hegelian philosophy itself, and would also critique everything under the sun: religion, state, morality, truth, legality, property rights, nationalism, republicanism, liberalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. It should be said pre-Marxist socialism, communism, but many of the critiques nonetheless probably likely still apply. And then Bauerian criticism and Feuerbach, and there are many pages that are filled with the critiques that are for Bruno Bauer and Feuerbach. Feuerbach being one who would be instrumental to Marx and Marx's understanding of communism. And unsurprisingly, it was quickly banned, but the surprise was that it was actually unbanned locally. This created a Streisand effect, where the book became widely popular, and however, nationwide it was banned by Christmas. The reception of the book and its interpretations are wide. And on one hand, there's praise for the book for deconstructing the ideologies that justify power and authority. On the other hand, it is seen as a book that corrupts the very foundations of moral and social life, and the reception and also the interpretations of what the book has to say continues to be diverse even still to this day. And so here we can see the first edition of the 1907, I believe, edition of Byington's translation of The Ego in Its Own. This would be, I believe, superseded by the newer translation. This is justified, in my opinion, largely because the Einzige is not, how do I say, not best translated as das Ich, because and it comes largely in response to a terminological and having taken a look, cross comparing the two translations, the how do I say, updating the language to be more comprehensible for our time, given that the book in 1907 was written in a very classical manner. Nonetheless, this work, translated by Landstreicher, this specific edition would be discontinued due to the publisher's issues that will be taken with with the translator's issues with the publisher, and this would be this cover here would be one that is you can find readily accessible if you wish to find the book. In case you're wondering, the picture here is an eclipse, which I think is fitting given that Stirner emphasizes the negativity overcoming even God. And here we have sea foam, perhaps demonstrating the transience, the temporal nature that Stirner also seems to emphasize. The first thing I want to emphasize also is the preface. This preface is striking and is likely the first place that many people are even introduced to Stirner. And it gives us an introductory cursory overview into what Stirner has to say as a whole. The first thing Stirner asks, and perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself, because I should also mention that in this preface is in fact a reference to the 1806 poem by Goethe, Vanitas, Vanitatum Vanitas, Vanity, Vanity, all is vanity, a reference to First Ecclesiastes, in which there is nothing new under the sun. Here, and even in the Goethe's poem, there is something that is very similar to what Stirner will be getting at here. Goethe emphasizes that there are thousands of different causes or affairs, Sache, which an individual might seek after. And the examples he gives is, for example, like money. And whenever I seek for money and I attain it, I nonetheless can lose it. Same for love, the glory in war. I participate in war and my friends die, I lose my leg. And I even if I have that glory, I still lose something. And so this poem demonstrates also the conditions that Stirner was in, given that it became a drinking song. And at the end, Goethe would proclaim that after I based my fare on nothing, nothing but myself, I have nothing to lose. And so may the wine flow. Stirner would do something similar and emphasize that there are thousands of different causes that a person can choose. And it is not necessarily the content of these causes that Stirner is concerned with, more so the form. There's God's cause, humanity's truth, freedom, justice, the cause of my people, my leader, my country, even the cause of mind or spirit. And this Stirner sees as something that is not necessarily enjoyable, is not even beneficial to the well-being of individuals, because these causes only concern themselves and not our well-being. Stirner gives the example of the nation and the wars that the nations fight for the sake of their nationhood. And Stirner says that look at those for whom for whom they serve. Look at those who fought for the sake of the nation. Their corpses are thrown gravely on the garbage heap of history, and demonstrates that these causes call for lives, sacrifices, and a classic example was with God. God has nothing outside of himself. Everything is God. God serves no higher purpose, is law, is truth, is morality itself, is the perfect example, the creator of the universe. Everything is a means to God's end. Stirner And the question Stirner seems to be asking towards this proposition is, if God serves no higher authority and asks us to follow his example, if we were to truly follow God's example, wouldn't we take also to have ourselves having no higher authority, and so on? Stirner says, and yet my own cause is never supposed to be my affair. Down with the egoist who only thinks of himself. This is where Stirner would turn the question. And this is where, because I'm a reading group leader, I'm very comfortable quoting Stirner at length, and we will take a look here. Stirner says, quote, God and humanity have based their affair on nothing but themselves. I likewise base my affair on myself. This I, who just like God, am the nothing of all others. This I, who am my all, this I, who am the unique. If God, if humanity, as you affirm, have enough content in themselves to be all in all to themselves, then I feel that I would lack it even less, and that I would have no complaint to make about my emptiness. I am not nothing in a sense of emptiness, but am the creative nothing, the nothing out of which I myself create everything as creator. Away then with every cause that is not completely my affair. You think that at least the good cause must be my affair? Which good? Which bad? I myself am my own affair, and I am neither good nor bad. Neither makes any sense to me. The divine is God's affair. The human cause is humanity's. My affair is neither divine nor the human. It is not the good, the true, the just, the free, etc., but only my own. And it is not general, but is unique, as I am unique. For me, there is nothing greater than me, end quote. So here we can see that in doing so, Stirner does not care for any higher cause, no higher cause, but he himself. And if in fact he is the nothing of all others, if God is everything and Stirner is nothing, then Stirner's nothingness, his emptiness, is his everything. And this creative nothingness is the condition from which he can create everything as creator. In a sense, Stirner turns his back towards God. This leads us to the form of Stirner's book, and also leads me to state that many of the ideas here I will be giving certainly not the definitive final say. Stirner's book, as said, has a wide range of and diverse viewpoints and perspectives, nor am I going to be giving a comprehensive or exhaustive understanding of the book as a whole. I will largely be speaking on subjects that I feel perhaps most poignant and perhaps practical to those listening, and perhaps also to myself. The first thing I want to demonstrate is that these bold points on the left demonstrates the form, and we can look at them as a column. In a very Hegelian way, Hegel, who equated history to psychological phases of development and also to religion, Stirner follows in suit, but critiques Hegelianism and those within the free, his comrades. And in many respects agrees with many of the propositions that Hegel has. However, while Stirner might agree with where and how Hegel gets to those conclusions, the conclusion that Hegel arrives at is a conclusion that Stirner does not agree with. For example, Stirner may agree with Hegel that Socrates was a force that was corrupting the youth, but not, while Hegel would praise the universality and the realm of spirit, the realm of forms, the realm of ideas that Socrates would put forth. Nonetheless, Stirner sees this as not as a good thing. Here to give the metaphor that Stirner gives, and it should keep in mind that this is a caricature, and likely Stirner doesn't necessarily believe in this. He is operating within Hegelian formalisms to deconstruct the arguments of his opponents, and so using the very arguments that his opponents are using to come to his very own conclusions. This is what makes Stirner a very funny philosopher, because he's using the points and the starting grounds from his opponents to demonstrate how it nonetheless comes to his conclusions. To give the metaphor, The child, in growing up, learns that there is this learns of being empowered or being powerless. Stirner describes this as a battle between victory and defeat. This perhaps can remind us of what Hegel says about the master and slave dialectic, that the master enslaves the slave, and the slave becomes not only dependent on the master, but the master becomes dependent on the slave. Eventually, however, Hegel posits that the slave may overcome this relationship here, just as within the dialectic, the internal contradictions within a particular thing undoes itself, towards which development and progress, and there's this moving forward, just as the classic example that Hegel gives: the seed becomes the bud, and the bud becomes the blossom. The bud, Hegel sees as containing an internal contradiction that generates its own alienation, its own other, which becomes the bud. Here, Hegel can be seen as one who's seen as concerned with becoming, and Stirner is just as concerned with that endeavor. However, as for the child which is associated with the external, with the world of things, and corresponds to the ancients, the pre-moderns, those pagans who are realists, the child perhaps breaks things to try to understand the nature of the behind them, and it is nature that the child fears, that the pagan fears, and blesses and worships. Just as the child might fear the father's belt, there comes a time, however, where the child no longer fears the father's belt, but overcomes objects through mind or spirit, and through mental capacities, through spiritual capabilities, no longer concerns themselves with things, but rather with the internal, with ideas. This corresponds to the moderns, which Stirner associates at the beginning of the Christian period, when the word becomes flesh. It is the idealistic period, but it is also the period of Germany, and is the period of Hegelianism and of his comrades, the free. Stirner sees his opponents, whom he criticizes, as still within this, which he eventually sees as being negated, coming to a full concretity with the adult who no longer is concerned with spirit or mental or the mind, but overcomes the mind, much like the child, in recognizing that there's something more fundamental. And this is where that fundamentality is understood to be perhaps the nothingness of the self. It is between the externalness and the internal, and Stirner reserves this for the future, and for atheism and egoism. One thing that should be noted is that there can be seen a wide variety of questions that Stirner has within his works, and many of those questions I see contain these three. It is, what am I, why or how ought I, and who am I? And we might see how these differ or develop within the current discussion that we have here. The first thing that we should say is that, begin with spirit. As someone who was very much involved within Hegelian philosophy, spirit is something that can fill volumes, and books can be written on the very subject. But for the sake of this lecture, I'm going to be very loose. Stirner defines the spirit as one's ideal. It is the unattained, the otherworldly. Spirit is the name of your God. God is spirit. For the sake of this discussion, I am going to perhaps say that, at least to Stirner, the spirit is something that begins with Jesus Christ dying on the cross, from which the spirit arises, as it says in the Bible, where 2 or 3 of you are, there shall I be also. It is the spirit, which has this rationalistic kernel to it, Stirner likely sees as a mere extension of the Christian Holy Spirit. To further quote Stirner, quote, "You are a fanatic against everything that is not spirit, and therefore you rail fanatically against yourself, as you aren't rid of a non-spiritual remainder. Instead of saying, I am more than spirit, you can tritely say, I am less than spirit, and I can only think about spirit, pure spirit, or the spirit that is nothing but spirit. But since I am not this, and since and I am not this. And since I am not this, it is another. It exists as another, whom I call God. This leads us into what Stirner has to say about spirit or Geist. Just to use the metaphor that was previously developed, as the child was realistic and concerned with the external world of things, the youth is concerned with the internal, the world of thoughts, the world of mind or spirit. Here, Stirner sees that there's still this division, just as with the child, their I was in relation to the not I of nature, so too with the spirit. However, it's a little bit more insidious here because the spirit is not an external thing anymore. It is an internal thing, is taken to be an internal thing too. For the young Hegelians, they would look at spirit as the autonomous and dynamic spiritual or mental foundation to everything. It has the rational kernel that can bring out the fall of what they saw as the very Christian monarchies, and they saw great potential within Hegel to deconstruct those the status quo of Germany and to perhaps go beyond it. As mentioned, that Hegel says what is real is rational. However, there's more to that quote, and it goes, what is rational is real. And this is where we can see the young Hegelians focusing on the latter aspect of that, focusing on reason to demonstrate that the current society could be more real, that it is not rational, and that we need a more rational basis to our status quo, whether that be through republicanism, through socialism, or humanism. Stirner points out that the spirit is something that is not only external, as is understood, like, for example, with the Holy Ghost, but is also sometimes internal. And from this, there's this divide that comes from the self identifying with the spirit, with the spiritual. So, for example, we have the law. The law is not only something written external for myself, the law is written on the fleshy tables of my heart. Whereas, for example, there is this understanding of rationality, and there are times when I can be rational, but I still nonetheless live up to the standard of rationality. Same thing goes with natural, that I seek to live a natural life, and and so on. There's all these examples of different ideals that people can seek with and see within themselves and seek after within themselves. I have created a chart here that demonstrates a few, but certainly not exhaustively demonstrating some of the concepts that are taken to be spiritual. It could be the true, the rational, the sacred, the eternal, the necessary, the essential, the perfect, the spiritual, the universal. In the Christian understanding, for example, I am not my body, I am my spirit. Certainly I have a body, but I am not my body. I'm something that is, there's something more essential to that, and that is my spirit, which is eternal and sacred, and is something that is, how do I say, perhaps also rational, if we're going to take this from after an Enlightenment perspective. What Stirner sees within this ultimately is that ideals and ideas aren't wholly real. They attempt to realize, if people attempt to directly realize these ideals, it is ultimately futile, because this results in self-flagellating scrupulosity these spirits possess. And this Stirner sees as the social consequences of these ideas of spirit and the attempt to crucify oneself for the sake of these spirits, to become spiritual. Here, we come to possession. To quote Stirner, quote, "Do you ever encounter those possessed by the devil? Or do we just as often encounter those possessed by the opposite, possessed by the good, by virtue, by morality, by the law, or by any other principle? Possessions by the devil are not the only ones. God acts in us, and so does the devil." End quote. And to further quote Stirner, quote, "Spiritual people will have something they've planted in their heads that is supposed to be realized. They have concepts of love, goodness, and the like, which they would like to see actualized. Therefore, they want, for example, to build a kingdom of love on earth. Love is supposed to rule. What they've planted in their head, what is one supposed to call it other than a fixed idea? Indeed, it haunts their heads, end quote. Here we get to the concept of a fixed idea. This is an idea that has subjugated people to itself. It overpowers and determines and fixes their identity and worldview over and upon themselves. Stirner says that this could be an axiom, a principle, or a standpoint taken to be absolute or sacred. Oftentimes, it is also taken to be something that offers a third-person objective or mediating perspective from an alien perspective. An example he gives is with Archimedes' fulcrum, where Archimedes said that if we can find a specific point outside of the Earth, we could move the Earth with a lever. Another example is God. God is this fundamental mediator that is the axiom or principle of the entire universe, including myself. And so I am, for example, God's child, and must follow God's example and so forth. Whereas even in the more modern and secular understanding, that this doesn't have to be God. It can be resurrected gods that are taken to be secular gods. These could be ideas or thoughts or concepts and essences. One example, and in fact, Stirner gives plenty of examples, is when a descriptive grammatical predicate is taken to be essential. This could include masculinity, rationality, Christianity, humanity, anything that a person sees within themselves or identifies with themselves. And it also needlessly becomes normativizing, becomes ought. And this is something that Stirner wishes to maintain a divide between. Stirner is not one who is fond of even of oughts for himself or even for others. And with this comes how do I say a type of self-torturing, for myself to be and to continue to be these things. Because if I'm not masculine, who am I? If I'm not a Christian, what am I? If I'm not a human, I'm acting inhumane. And so there's this question of identity that comes into play when these grammatical predicates are taken to be essential, or in fact one's identity. In fact, they become a concept that universalizes people and mediates people, where people, for example, if they're Christian, they may only love the Christian spouse, the spouse of theirs that is Christian. And once their spouse, for example, leaves religion, then I no longer know you, and so they get divorced, for example. I say this as someone within a very Christian state in the United States, so I see that all the time. This leads us to the concept of perhaps the non-concept of the phantasm. To quote Stirner, "Man, your head is haunted. You have bats in your belfry. You're imagining things, painting for yourself a whole world of gods that is there for you, a haunted realm to which you are called, an ideal that beckons to you. You have a fixed idea. What then is a fixed idea? An idea that has subjected people to itself." This, in the older translation, would be known as a spook. And this has generated plenty of memes of Stirner as a spook buster from the Ghostbusters movies, as a philosopher for Halloween. But there is justification. The justification for the change of this translation is that a spook seems to indicate that it is a thing, whereas a phantasm seems to indicate that it is an experience, which I would also happen to agree with the translator in this regard, that it is something that is experienced for the individual, but is not necessarily something that is tangible or concrete. For this reason, it's perhaps comparable to a social construct or a reification, something that is abstract, but yet nonetheless taken to be concrete, something that cannot be touched or felt, but nonetheless is seen and experienced everywhere. A simple formula that I give is that the spirit, when it haunts or possesses, is a phantasm. And this is something that we can see within Stirner's larger work. But this is how do I say? Stirner describes this as when the body appears embodied, when the bodiless becomes embodied, when, to use a Christian language, when the word becomes flesh. This often comes with the purging of its unspoken opposite, to do away with what is considered not I. If we remember the chart I gave, it was the temporal, the base, it was the I believe the body, and so forth. And so there are cases where this is seen everywhere. Stirner describes how people are seeing ghosts in every corner. This happens when an abstract noun becomes an adjective, an attributive adjective. For example, the saintly is something for the saintful. I see the saintful within me because I see myself as a saint, and I seek to be nothing but a saint and thus saintful. But the purging of this unspoken opposite is what Stirner describes as a Dan-eyed labor. It is seeking to pick up water with a strainer, with a colander, and is an infinite, never-ending task, because ultimately for Stirner, words are not things. They do not wholly, exhaustively articulate the totality of what is being signified. And this leads to this neurotic attempt to overcome this gap. Another example Stirner gives is masculinity with the masculine. This, for example, perhaps in the more modern perspective, we can see those who seek to do nothing but be male, be masculinity themselves. And what Stirner seems to indicate that is that those who are most concerned with these things, with becoming these things, with being these things, are those who have the least of it, or in their mind, having the least of it, or are so deathly afraid of seeing within themselves the opposite. Just as, for example, the saint is no longer, is of a, how do I say, the saint is afraid of sin that dwells in their breast, but whereas perhaps the more atheistic liberal might look at the mirror and say, I see the inhuman in me, the irrational in me, because I identify with rationality or humanity. This unspoken opposite is something Stirner sees as demonstrating the lack of universality in these supposed universal concepts, these concepts that are often taken to be universal. It demonstrates that within themselves that they undermine themselves. For example, civility and those that are civil, often contrasted with barbarity and barbarians. Stirner demonstrates that these concepts internally contradict with themselves. In this regard, much of what Stirner does could be understood to be an immanent critique. But it's not as if Stirner wants to have a completely phantasm, do completely away with spirit. It is this relationship. It is when spirit possesses a person, when a spirit has a person, that Stirner is concerned with, because he sees this as beneficial to himself. This is largely because Stirner really is only writing for himself, and he's not putting up a universal standard for people to programmatically follow either. He's writing this just for himself. The relationship is what he's concerned with, that ideas have people, that I must identify with this thing, and doing otherwise I am not myself, and I torture and contort myself to be this idea of a thing, when in actuality it's just an idea. And this is where we get to a quote, we are indeed supposed to have spirit, but spirit's not supposed to have us, end quote. And furthermore, quote, once the things of the world have become vain, so too the thoughts of the spirit must also become vain. Here we can see Stirner once again using the logic of Christianity, the logic of spirit of thoughts, to undermine thoughts. So too, as Christianity looks upon the material world as something which moth and dust doth corrupt, but the spirit is something that is eternal, that one must be concerned more with their spirit than the bodily, to be concerned with the word of God than bread. Here Stirner will go even beyond things and the spirit itself, in a move of pure blasphemy, as it is understood that the Holy Ghost, to blaspheme against the Holy Ghost, is understood largely within the Christian realm as being the the worst sin of them all. This leads us to the dissolution of spirit. But who will dissolve the spirit into its nothing? He who by means of the spirit portrays nature as the null, finite, ephemeral. He alone can also bring the spirit down to the same nullity. I can do it. Any one of you who prevails and creates a sovereign I can do it. In a word, the egoist can do it. This realm of thoughts is waiting for its deliverance so that it can finally go to death. I am the destroyer of its continued existence because in the creator's realm, it no longer forms a realm of its own, but a creation of my creative thoughtlessness. And this is where Stirner deliberately sins against the concept of spirit. It is through this that we can see egoism. Now, contrary to most perspectives and modern understandings of egoism, Stirner's egoism is quite different. And for this reason, I'm going to say that we put those aside because Stirner's egoism is very different and is largely understood to be within the context of Feuerbach's humanism. To speak of Feuerbach in relation to Christianity thought that we could do away with the God of Christianity, which was divisive, which was too particular, and create a more universal religion known as humanism that would not, exclude those who were not Christian, but would include everyone, thus universal. This could be done through switching the grammatical predicate and the subject. And for example, if God is love, we would instead say love is divine. This is how we could secularize many of the Christian propositions. Stirner, however, takes issue with this because Feuerbach still maintains an understanding of the sinner, which comes with the inhuman, the egoist. This is perhaps where it is best to understand Stirner's egoism as emphasizing the unspoken opposite of humanism. But it is nonetheless through this sin, through sinning against the concept, that sin no longer bears any meaning. Just as with Christianity, one must sin against the spirit, must sin against the concept of Christianity to no longer even consider sin to be something of even any value. It is through activity that Stirner is emphasizing here perhaps something even more universal, something even more perhaps positive. To quote Stirner, quote, "What religion calls the sinner, humanitarianism calls the egoist. But again, the egoist before the humane shudder is as much as a phantasm as the devil is. He exists only as a nightmare, a phantasmic image in their brain. If they were not naively drifting back and forth in the old-fashioned opposition between good and evil, to which they've given the modern names of humane and egoistic, they wouldn't have polished up the hoary sinner into the egoist either, and sewed a new patch onto an old cloak." Here, we can see Stirner perhaps positing a way beyond the binary between good and evil. This is where we can step upon egoism, as Stirner describes it. This understanding of what has post-mortem been described by John Welsh's book, 2010 book, known as dialectical egoism, to emphasize the more Hegelian aspects of this egoism. Its dialectical nature to dissolve binaries. If Stirner is to be related to any more to the concepts of egoism that we might be relatable, it might be best perhaps understood as descriptive psychological egoism. But even this is something I would be critical of, because to say that someone is an essentially or fundamentally egoist would once again be something that Stirner would be critical of. The other thing is that this, I should say, he would be critical of this because this would once again be infixing a person's identity, and they would be limited in their ability to move beyond this to be self-determining. This is why it's perhaps understood as something that is the negative, this demonstrating the lack of universality in humanism. Nonetheless, Stirner's egoism demonstrates aims for self-mastery, creative self-expression, authentic self-enjoyed living, irrespective of any alien standard, and affirms the degraded values common to everyday experience. Um, it does not wholly support, for example, um, the acquiring of money, because that too can become something that subordinates an individual to that ideal becomes neurotic and scrupulous. So in this way, Stirner is not following the egoistic from the humanistic perspective, where he checks off all the boxes of what evil does. Instead, Stirner lives irrespective of this division, and perhaps we could say it goes beyond these divisions of sacred, profane, sublime, and based, high and low, and good and bad. The key way Stirner does away with this division, as I said, is through the profane. In this way, Stirner wants to not only do away with God, but the very idea of God. And it's not enough merely to do away with the Bible. One must use it for toilet paper as well. And so it is through consumptive appropriation, through the profane, through profaning against what is deemed sacred, that Stirner is also concerned with. It is not the content of these things in themselves. It is rather perhaps the relationship, the power that an individual has given themselves over towards. And so, looking back at this chart, Stirner doesn't just affirm the above row or of the rational, but he affirms the experiences of everyday life, not the irrational, the profane, and the temporal, the contingent, the accidental, the imperfect. And this way, Stirner can be seen as offering us a way of letting go of concepts that rule us, but also a way of moving on and of being more self-compassionate. This leads us to the next concept that is associated with egoism, ownness. To give a metaphor, which I'll quote at length, quote, "Around the altar, a church bulges its arches, and its walls are moving further and further out, but the enclosed is the sacred. You can no longer reach out for it, no longer touch it. Howling with a devouring hunger, you wander around these walls, searching for the little that is profane, and the circles of your path keep on extending further and further. Soon the whole church will embrace the whole world, and you'll be driven out to the furthest edge. One more step, and the world of the sacred has triumphed. You sink into the abyss. So take courage while there's still time. Stray no longer in the overgrazed profane. Dare the leap and rush in through the gates into the sanctuary itself. When you devour the sacred, you have made it your own. Digest the sacramental wafer, and you are rid of it." End quote. And to bring in one more quote, because I do feel that it is important, quote, "Alien power that I leave to another, makes me a bondsman." I believe the German here is Knellschaft, or a slave, as is sometimes translated. "So may my own power make me an owner. May I then pull back the power that I've conceded to others out of ignorance about the strength of my own power. May I say to myself, where my power reaches, that is my property. And may I lay claim to everything as property that I feel myself strong enough to attain. And may I get my actual property to extend as far as I authorize, that is, as far as I empower myself to take." To give a meme to perhaps exemplify what Stirner says here, if Stirner wants something, he looks to no one but himself to take it, compared to perhaps moralists or humanists who value property, the private property, not just private property, but the property rights a lot more than he does. This leads us into perhaps what could be considered the opposite of being possessed by an idea. Ownness sees as the capacity or power one has to reappropriate or repossess their alienated qualities or properties, and to do away with perhaps even this alienation itself. In this respect, Stirner, to put perhaps made wittily, wishes to alienate the alienating, to expropriate the expropriated. and sees to perhaps not only appropriate these concepts, but to dissolve recognition of this very distinction itself. This is because Stirner affirms within the human not just that which is deemed sacred, that which is higher, um, but also that which is seen as the base within a person. This is in respect to Feuerbach's humanism, where Feuerbach says that we still have higher measures that humans must live up to the concept of humanity. Stirner is critical of this because if I'm human, then I don't need to live up to anything else because I am it. I am already human, and I need not to seek for anything more than that, because or seek to be humane, because I am it. So likewise, he gives a very similar explanation with masculinity. If I am male and I'm perhaps recognized as male, sure, I am a male, but I am not all male. Maleness does not fully exhaust me nor my qualities. In fact, I'm more than male, um, and I need not to seek after masculinity because I'm it. But this is not just. Stirner says that we can like appropriate and repossess these qualities, but it's also there comes a point where we can joyfully dissolve the very recognition of this distinction itself, where it doesn't matter what gender or what religion or various other positions that we can get to. One example that Stirner gives is freedom, that it doesn't matter if I'm granted freedom, especially from an alien source, because if this is a freedom that comes from an alienating source, it is an alien freedom, and it can be alienated from me once again. It is not my freedom. In this respect, Stirner says that being self-owned, that me as myself, I am, how do I say, I am already, quote unquote, free. Stirner sees being self-owning as prior to even freedom, and gives the example of a slave who, as is understood in abject unfreedom, externally, but even internally, if they were not free, Stirner says that nonetheless I am my own because it is my body that moans. It is my body that experiences these things. So even if we were to take the position of like libertarian free will or hard determinism, I think Stirner's nevertheless not question, because this experience is mine, that it is happening to me. The same thing can be said that religion is another example that people measure themselves up to. For example, living after the quality of Christianity, of being Christian. But Stirner recognizes that instead of his particular individual living up to the universality of this religion, Stirner says, what if I reduce this universality to my own particularity, to myself, and say, I am my own religion. Here we can see perhaps actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, because here we can see what Stirner does with God is that if God is all in all, if God is everything, and I'm nothing, and so I absolutely need God, I'm dependent on God. There's this recognition that, how do I say, there is this potential for me to revolt against this dependence, and in this way, we can say, even if God did exist for Stirner, Stirner would nonetheless turn his back on God. And from this, if God is the example from which we must follow, and God has no example other than himself, ironically, the thing that we can do to follow God's example is to follow no God but ourselves. And in that respect, understand ourselves to be our own morality, understand ourselves to have our own purpose, our own purposes, our own ways, to be more than any other concept, but to see these perhaps as a quality or attribute that someone can attribute, but does not fully exhaust me, nor does fully determine me. And so in this respect, morality, prescribed purposes, gender norms, objective truth, or and even God in a classic Christian sense is unnecessary, because I can see myself in my own world as following my own religion. And I need not live up to this religion because I am it. Same thing with morality, and purpose and gender and so forth, that I'm not masculine or feminine or non-binary. I am myself. My gender is myself, or perhaps we can understand ourselves to not even care about gender. I express myself the way I express myself, and if I'm understood to be feminine, masculine, and so on, it's irrelevant to me. This is where we can take Stirner, as he says, ownness is one's whole existence, is oneself. It has no alien standard since it is only a description of the owner. And from this, we can say that this description does not fully exhaust the individual, because Stirner points towards something perhaps even more fundamental. This is the unique, the Einzige. The human being is called to nothing and has no mission, no purpose, no more than a plant or a beast has a calling. The flower doesn't follow the calling to complete itself, but applies all its forces to consume and enjoy the world as best it can. What am I in the world for this purpose? To realize ideas, to do my part towards the realization of the idea of the state through my citizenship, or to bring the idea of the family into existence through my marriage as a husband and calling and father? How I dispute such a calling. I live as little after calling as the flower grows and gives fragrance after a calling. And to further quote Stirner, end quote, I was despicable because I sought my better self outside myself. I was the inhuman because I dreamed of the human. I was like the pious who hunger after their true I and always remain poor sinners. I thought of myself only in comparison to another. Enough. I was not all in all, was not unique. But now I cease to appear to myself as inhuman, cease to measure myself and let myself be measured by the human, cease to recognize anything over me. I've only been the inhuman, and now I am no longer this, but I am the unique. Indeed, to your disgust, the egoistic, but not the egoistic as it lets itself be measured by the human, humane and unselfish, but the egoistic as the unique. Here, Stirner is pointing towards, as said, something that's more fundamental. Perhaps we can take it to be the owner of these properties, these attributes. It is the self. This has been in the older translations translated as the ego, and indeed, it is not a bad. Well, I'm going to say I do think it is a bad translation. It is in fact it is common to take it as an I, but even as two, as one's I, as one's das Ich. Or one's ego, to use the older translation. Stirner doesn't see that this I is something that is eternal either. It is not something universal, like Fichte. Fichte would say that the I is absolute, and from this absolute I, we can draw moral, more metaphysical claims. Stirner does not believe in this. If he speaks of an I, he does not speak of the I. He speaks of my I, and once again demonstrates because of he says this my I. It is once again a concept of property. Selfhood becomes a property to Stirner, and it is not something that is taken to be absolute. It is not a concept to follow, but nonetheless, Stirner does understand it as a power of his property, a power of his ownness. But there is this something that is more, I'm going to say, fundamental. It is this thing that resists any sort of grounding, and it is the unique. This Stirner posits as something that, on one hand, is absolutely particular, but also absolutely universal. It is paradoxical in that sense because it is everywhere and also nowhere. This is because the unique, if it is truly to be unique, is not something that is brought in relation to any other concept. For example, like greenness is a universal concept, and we see that concept embodied in particular things. Whereas if it's unique, then it is, how do I say, it cannot be brought into these very concepts, but nonetheless is still a concept that that is somehow universal. This is Stirner's attempt to identify non-identical. To name the unnameable. It is something without content or essence, without linguistic foundation. And in this way, it only points towards pure difference or singularity. Just as, for example, a name only points towards you, it is not you. It is not the you. If you were to change your name, as I am perhaps thinking of changing my name since I don't like it. My father gave it to me and I want a better name. I can choose a different name, and indeed it becomes a property of mine that I can change at will. It's something that I can do away with. It is not essential to me. Nonetheless, it points towards me, but it is not me. There is no task that lies in seeking to accomplish or fulfill or attain selfhood, because I, I already am that. I am it. And so in this way, Stirner sees it as unifying both particularity and universality in a way that is different from Hegel, who says that it is the individual who nonetheless must live up to a greater universality and support, for example, like familyhood, the state, God, etc. And in this way, Stirner sees it as logic dying in what is not even a phrase, because the unique is also this self-undermining concept that, as said, it is also everywhere and nowhere. It is everything and nothing, and points towards and seeks to name the unnameable. It seeks to it is a totalizing singularity. This, nonetheless, is something that is Stirner describes as in relation to himself, and we can read this here, quote, "Everything turns around you. You are the center of the outer world and of your inner world. Your world extends as far as your capacity, and what you grasp is simply your own because you grasp it. You, the unique, are the unique, only together with your property. Meanwhile, it doesn't escape you that what is yours is still itself its own at the same time. That is, it has its own existence. It is the unique, the same as you. At this point, you forget yourself in sweet forgetfulness." In this way, we can perhaps understand Stirner not as a solipsist. Stirner recognizes that there are things that are external to him, but his relation to those things, his attitude towards those things, is something that he has control of, something that is in his power, and something that he can perhaps make his property. Just because it has an alien or external to him, and he does not have power over it, is not something that Stirner would have to automatically will deem as sacred. A quote he gives is, "Just as the moon is out of my reach, must I regard it as sacred? No, I'm only biding my time before I grasp it." In this way, we can also recognize that Stirner is not saying that just because I have no essence, that I can be anything, that I can do anything. Stirner recognizes that there are limits. Recognizes, for example, like if there was a boulder in my way, I wait my time until I can gather enough powder to blow it up. In this regard, Stirner does not regard what is alien as sacred. He regards it as something that is soon to be appropriated if he wishes, and often speaks of this appropriation, this acquiring of what is alienating, that which is alienating, as enjoyful, as something that brings sweet self-forgetfulness. Stirner gives the example of a beer. You have this object of desire, the object that you desire, and you unify yourself with that object, and this unity Stirner sees as having excellence. And this way we can see perhaps a type of hedonism in Stirner. Nonetheless, because of this attitude towards things, of not being ruled by not just things but thoughts, there's this interesting similarity also between perhaps Stoicism. And so also in this quote, we can see what Stirner means by the unique in his property. It is that the unique is in their world, and their world extends so far as it is their property. And so in this respect, my world ends where I stop perceiving it. It is no longer my world. Nonetheless, Stirner does not regard the world outside of him as something universal, he recognizes it nonetheless if he comes into contact with it as his property. In this respect, Stirner recognizes within his world nothing alien. There is nothing else. There's nothing within it that how do I say that Stirner will give reverence towards. He might fear something, but he will not revere it. To move on, this Stirner will use to answer a few questions. These questions will be, what am I? And this comes in opposition to Feuerbach, who says, I am human. Stirner says rather, no, I am unique. And this is to fulfill this grammatical subject and predicate. I am unique. I am singular. How ought I to act? However I might, as I am my own self. I am the measure of all things. An even more radical statement than Protagoras could offer. And who am I? Why, no one, nothing but I, myself. Deleuze would comment on this, for example, and see that Stirner moving the question of what to who or which would be the undermining of the dialectic itself. And from this demonstrating the nihilism of the dialectic, the nothingness upon which it is predicated. Stirner writes, quote, every higher essence over me, be it God, be it the human being, weakens the feelings of my uniqueness and only pales before the sun of this awareness. If I base my affair on myself, the unique, then it stands on the transient, the mortal creator who consumes himself, and I may say, I have based my affair on nothing. And that's how Stirner ends his book. Just as he begins it with nothing, he ends it with nothing. Very similar to Goethe, but also very similar to Hegel in how it ends how it begins. It ends on the nothingness that is excluded from the absolute. In this respect, if I am not included within the absolute, then since the absolute concerns itself only with itself, I don't have to concern itself with it, and I can concern myself with it, with myself, if I so desire. Here, this is perhaps a challenge. This book offers us a challenge to look at ourselves and question what things we do and for whose or which sake do we do it, and to perhaps reorient ourselves towards life not as something that must be sought for, but as something something that one already has, and something one must only squander or waste away according to how they see fit. In this way, there's a great amount of self-empowering in regard to one's life, that one over oneself is their greatest authority. And if one can question God, the ultimate creator and ultimate arbiter of law and justice itself, Stirner says that unlike pious atheists who might nonetheless maintain that there is morality despite God, despite the lack of God, Stirner would maintain, even if there is a God, I am still the judge of myself. I can be my own entitler of my own property, my own mediator of my own power, and my own self, and do away with understandings that take myself to be Christian, to take Christ as the mediator, and take God's kingdom as the property or title or that I must serve therein. I am myself. Have my own power over myself, and I am in my own world. In this respect, because Stirner recognizes everything within his property, Stirner can also perhaps be seen as has been commented by Jacob Blumenfeld, as a first-person Marxist, willing to appropriate or to expropriate the things that are alien from him, since he considers the concept of the concept of myself as identical, but criticizes his opponents who don't take us to be identical, who nonetheless degrade the particular I, and yet hold up the universal our, because it still nonetheless contains a them. In this regard, Stirner wishes to have a reorientation, not towards himself, not just towards himself, but also towards others, that I don't just recognize, for example, in myself, this ability, this nothingness from which I can create anything and everything. It also demonstrates that perhaps in others there is this nothingness, and I can recognize and not hold them um, to standards that perhaps alienate them, but recognize them as a part of my world and um, act towards them and also towards myself in a way that is open to them changing and open towards seeing them beyond perhaps the labels that I may ascribe to them. This leads us to Stirner's legacy. Stirner would die in 1856. This would be 12 years after Stirner had written As Unique and as Property. Afterwards, he would respond a year later to critiques of his work. It is known as Stirner's critics. I think Stirner's Recensenden, I think is what it is in German. Stirner would respond to a follower of Bruno Bauer, Scelsia, and he would also respond to Feuerbach and a comrade of Marx, Moses Hess. But soon after this, in the wake of the 1848 revolutions, which would sweep over Europe, Stirner's book would largely remain unknown. After a year later, after his book was published, I think in 1845, Stirner's would seek to create a business, a milk shop, where he would distribute milk from the countryside into the city. This would be a failure, and he would use his wife's dowry to do this, and for financial and other concerns. His marriage, which I actually didn't even mention, with Marie Danhart in 1843, where he met her in the Hippel's wine bar in the Freien. They their marriage would be a complete mockery of the concept of marriage itself, which goes to show how how comedic Stirner was. Nonetheless, because he would quit his job in 1844 because of his book, he expected that he would receive big backlash and likely be fired, and he from his position, because he had to be someone who would affirm the worst qualities of humanity, and be critical towards morality and God and nation, and not just that, but republicanism and nationalism and so forth. After he would quit from this, he would do translation work for Otto Wigand. He would translate French articles, French books, but also Adam Smith's English work, The Wealth of Nations, into German. And we can see this. So he also had an interest in political economy, just as much as Marx had. And despite him and Smith's disagreements on property and the question of what mediates a human exchange, for example, money. And so after pretty much living in poverty and being put into prison, debtor's prison for most of his later life, Stirner would die from, from an infection that came from, I forgot what it was called. What was a tumor in his neck. Some say it was from an infected bug bite, but after re-looking at the biography this morning, I actually discovered how wrong that was likely wrong, and that myth survives today, which I just realized. This would inspire Marx. Stirner's book would inspire Marx and Engels largely in critique, but I also want to focus that it also changed their perspective. Engels would have immediately gotten a copy of the book, and he was immediately enthralled by it and recommended to Marx, saying great things about it, although being a little skeptical, but nonetheless says that, quote, "We are communists out of egoism," and recognizes that they want a communist society for their sake, for their own selfish sake. And so while Marx's response was lost, it likely didn't please him, since Engels apologized to Stirner, and then they would go on to later write the German ideology, which critiques Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, I think also Moses Hess, and oh, there's one other utopian socialist, Wilhelm Waiting. But for the most part, it would actually be critiquing Max Stirner. And this would, the number of pages devoted to Max Stirner, whom they call Sancho from Don Quixote, a person who sees, how do I say, specters everywhere. And they would also call him Saint Max and Stirner, since they read Stirner as putting up a new ideal, a new religion. It would be written in 1845 to 46, but it wouldn't be published until 1832. And this in 1832, it would spark a little bit of a revival of Max Stirner after Nietzsche would be that revival. The thing that we can see as influencing Marx from Nietzsche is, while Stirner was concerned with deconstructing ideology, alienating oneself, Marx seems to ask how these alienating ideologies arise from a materialist sense. Stirner seems to gloss over that, and even within his article, the art and religion, it doesn't get into it from a materialist perspective. And so here, Marx wants to know how these books arose materially, and not just deconstruct them ideologically, but to deconstruct them materially. And so here we can see perhaps Marx and also Engels break away from the moralisms of Feuerbachian idealism, no longer just critiquing capitalists for being selfish, but because if they wanted their own, communist vision to succeed, they were doing it out of their own selfishness. And so this moved them towards a communist historical materialism. It is also, as people more of what's it? Oh, I forget his name. Of those who subscribe to a young Marx and the old Marx as a epistemological break, I believe that Althusser would comment upon. This does seem to indicate this would lend favor to that thesis, which I cannot explore further because I'm not very familiar with Marx himself. Nonetheless, in 1890, as Nietzsche was rising in popularity, Stirner would also rise in popularity during this. And this is where we would get the biographer of Stirner reading, I believe, Friedrich Lang's History of Materialism and coming across Stirner, and would be fascinated with Stirner and becoming his biographer and collecting all of his major works. And for the most part, that's the only reason why we know Stirner today, because of the biography and the collection that John Henry Mackay did of Stirner in the 1890s. And still to this day, in the English-speaking world, many of the minor writings of Stirner have yet to be translated to English. But nonetheless, I think we found in a compilation that Mackay would compile in the 1890s and revise and have a second edition, I believe, in 1907. Nonetheless, we can be certain that Nietzsche knew of Stirner because he owned these books in his library that reference Stirner. But Hartmann, who would be the author of the above book there, The Philosophy of the Unconscious, which also would also, I believe, influence Freud or Jung. He would go so far to accuse Nietzsche of plagiarism, and this would inspire a debate and widespread a widespread question of whether Stirner did influence Nietzsche. Some saying, of course, he did. Some saying no. Georg Simmel, for example, the sociologist, would say there's no relation between the two. Rudolf Steiner, the librarian that took care of Nietzsche's library after he had died, given to him by his Nazi sister, he would say that there was no direct influence, but there was still, you can see parallels. And then, of course, as mentioned, Deleuze would see there being that there was an influence from Stirner to Nietzsche, but a negative one, because Deleuze reads Nietzsche as responding to Stirner's nihilism, and so wants to read Nietzsche as one who seeks to overcome the nihilism that he sees in Stirner, and so sees within Nietzsche the second affirmative, more positive side. This is something that I perhaps disagree with. Perhaps I do think Stirner does offer a positive philosophy, primarily within the second half of his book, and this concerns itself mainly on the questions of power, property, and self-enjoyment. And so Stirner would orient himself and his world towards these things. But nonetheless, I will concede that Stirner does have a very negative philosophy and critiques a wide variety of things without positing anything constructive. Nonetheless, in the early 20th century, the question of Stirner and Nietzsche was either dismissed or abandoned, but nonetheless would still attract a small minority, Deleuze being a small example. And for the most part, how do I say, it's hard to prove a negative, and because of this, those who are Stirnerian wish to see Stirner's influence accepted and see that Stirner had a great deal of influence in philosophy, particularly through Nietzsche. And of course, those who are Nietzschean don't want to see that relation. And the other thing we know is that Nietzsche was familiar with people who attended the Freien and who were left Hegelian. I believe he was told to read David Strauss's The Life of Jesus, and I believe some of Bruno Bauer's work. I believe he also met some of the Freien, some of the members there. But nonetheless, personally, I go with the position that Nietzsche was not heavily influenced by Stirner, but nonetheless, I do think that there are parallels between the two. But once again, because I'm not majorly familiar with Nietzsche, I can't make major comments. However, I will say the comments that those of my friends who are Nietzscheans, I think the major difference that they see within Nietzsche and Stirner is that Nietzsche is more of an aristocrat. He focuses in the traditional Greek sense, and he focuses on more of the powerful, emphasizing, how do I say, the hierarchy, those strong men. Nietzsche, and so while Nietzsche perhaps sees only a few men being Übermensch, or perhaps even capable of being Übermensch, Stirner sees within himself and everyone excellence, and in this way, everyone is unique, but only has yet to affirm it, to be conscious of it, to voluntarily choose themselves and see themselves at the beginning, middle, and end of all things. And so in this respect, Stirner perhaps could be seen as more egalitarian, but nonetheless sees everyone as aristocratic. In that way, there's perhaps another similarity between Nietzsche. Nonetheless, I have stated my opinion. I don't think there's a major influence on Nietzsche, in my personal opinion, but the fact that there is that influence becomes an interesting gateway into perhaps Hegelian philosophy for those who like Nietzsche. This would also influence homosexual expression because of Stirner's critique of gender and heterosexuality. This would, this would influence the first gay periodical in the world, published by Adolf Brandt, as seen on the right. It started from 1896 and would go from 1832. I believe that would be not, is that quite, I'm not good at doing math right now. A little bit more than 36 years, I believe. In either case, it was discontinued in 1933 due to the Nazis. And they viewed male homosexuality as the fullest expression and love of and acceptance of one's gender. They're not without their own problems. They tended to be ones who loved men so much that they tended to sometimes hate women. And but nonetheless, Adolf Brand would be someone who would help with the Institute of Sexualwissenschaft, I think with Hirschfeld, and be one of the first places that would seek to study homosexuality and queerness as we understand it today. And this would be an image of the first edition of Der Eigene. It would also influence radical feminism. Dora Madison's Modernist Feminist Journal would be very radical in respect to first wave feminism and the suffragettes. In many ways, she would be critical of the suffragettes because they would focus only on white middle class moral women. But in this respect, Madison would argue that there also needs to be economic and social self-sufficiency for women and not just political equality. And so they would argue for female independence from the norms of society including the norm of femininity itself, and virginity, for example. And so would be very much in favor of understanding and sympathizing those who might, for example, be sex workers, or for those who aren't traditionally feminine. And this would influence the journal The Egoist, which many modern authors would comment in. I think T.S. Eliot, H.G. Wells are a few people who would submit a few of these to her journals. Also, politically, which and the politics of Stirner I have largely left aside, because I presented this to my college, so I didn't want to get in trouble with the state. And those, nonetheless, it would influence individualist anarchists such as Renzo Novatore, anarcho-communists such as Emma Goldman, Ito Noe, and Osugi Sakai, and I should mention I have done a few translations of Osugi Sakai. So there is some new content of his, which is interesting commentary, Japanese commentary on Stirner's works. And so here we can see pictured to the right Emma Goldman, who would be influenced both by Nietzsche, by Stirner, and by Peter Kropotkin, and would be someone similar to Dora Matson. But she would go basically she'd be one of the most famous anarchists in the world, and would do cross-country tours speaking on egoism, and would go, in fact, to participate in the civil war in Spain for the CNI-FAT, I believe that's the acronym. And so there are those who are Stirnerians who are very fond of Emma Goldman, just as there are those who are also fond of Renzo Novatore, because of his illegalism, in which he would, I believe I was told that he would basically steal from banks and give it to poor communities, but I can't be certain of that because I'm not very familiar with Renzo Novatore. Furthermore, we get into insurrectionary anarchists with Alfredo Bonanno. Insurrection is a concept of Stirner that he uses in relation to revolution. This is a concept I didn't cover in my presentation until now, and this concept of insurrection is seen as something even more fundamental to a revolution. Stirner posits that a revolution of things only revolves. It only replaces one God with another, one state, one power with another power, one structure or arrangement with another arrangement. Stirner, rather, instead of putting hopes and faith in something above oneself, looks to himself and places no hopes on glittering institutions, whether it be a republic or a monarchy, both are a majesty, and seeks to rather to arrange himself rather than be arranged. Alfredo Bonanno, I think also similar to Renzo Novatore, would focus on this insurrectionary direct action, on having this direct action and being, how do I say, and operating within a prefigurative, I think a prefigurative politics here, where the, how do I say, where you live irrespective of the norms. And so, but I believe Alfredo Bonanno, I believe he's in prison right now. I don't remember. Either way, he is a voice that has taken a great inspiration from Stirner. And then we get to post-anarchists, which is a more recent phenomenon, in which they would see within post-anarchism, which they would see within post-structuralism or post-modernism, and the theorists and authors thereof, a compatibility with Stirner, but also because they directly reference Stirner. Stirner once again comes about in the 1860s and 90s within post-structuralist and later postmodern philosophy. And post-anarchists would be led by, the term would be coined by Saul Newman. And this, how do I say, this would seek to combine post-structuralist philosophy with an anarchist political theory, and would take inspiration from thinkers such as Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze and Guattari, perhaps Lacan, but also as a major figure, Stirner, to critique the meta-narratives that determine one's life and one's behavior, and the potential to decenter these narratives and to deconstruct these narratives for the sake of oneself. Duane Rizell is another person who is a post-anarchist who, how do I say, who, for example, looks at through a Lacanian lens to look at how Stirner might be applied in a psychoanalytic framework. I think many in attendance would be happy to hear that Saul Newman, I think, lives within Australia, but I don't know if he's on the west or east. I forget. In either case, this takes us to today. In 2007, the new translation of the Uniqueness property would come about through Landstreicher's work. And this would bring a recent revival of Stirnerian philosophy. Blumenfeld has openly said that he wouldn't have published this without the translation and also perhaps also the memes. This is why there's a strong meme community of those who enjoy Stirner, and this is also could be considered Stirnerian praxis because you take a meme, you don't regard it as something sacred, but use it for yourself, change it, and share it because you enjoy it. Blumenfeld would be the one to coin the idea that Stirner is a first-person Marxist because he wishes to alienate that which is alienating, to turn his back on God and to do away with alienation itself. And in 2018, his book would, I would argue, be the best introduction to Stirnerian thought itself. He would also look at it from an ethical perspective in a Levinasian sense, which looks at the reorientation, the relationship that I think is often lost within the Stirnerian discussions, this relationship that one has with oneself and others that is often ignored and leads to, I would argue, disastrous consequences of treating other people and oneself and one's world as NPCs. And this is something that Stirner does comment upon that perhaps I don't think he would necessarily agree with, because these individuals are a part of my world. Indeed, I can do however I wish, but because I am in my world and my world is partly of me, Stirner perhaps would argue for a self-love, that this self-love extends from himself and extends to the entirety of his world. And furthermore, to 2020, Steplovich, a Hegelian scholar, would publish On the Path of Doubt, which would become the most comprehensive analysis of Stirner's Hegelian roots and of the young Hegelians in general. Unfortunately, he would pass later that year, and so this is the last work of his. He has done major work to look at how Stirner aligns with the Hegelian philosophy. If not sometimes despite being against it. There are many we can see nonetheless Stirner's Hegelian roots, especially with the scholarship that Steplovich has done. And then furthermore, we get to 2023, in which this year was the first annual Max Stirner Symposium, in which we had anyone who has been writing and speaking on Stirner. This includes Saul Newman, this includes Roselle, I forget his, Dwayne Roselle. I believe Todd May spoke there or was scheduled to speak there. My good friend Adam Jones would speak there representing the Acid Horizon podcast, and a variety of other thinkers who are quite important to Stirnerian scholarship today. And so that leads me to the end of my presentation here. I have recommendations for those who want to do further reading. As I said, I do think Blumenfeld's book, All Things Are Nothing to Me, is the best book to read if you want an introduction to Stirner. And then perhaps Steplovich's Max Stirner On the Path of Doubt, I think are the two best books to get an introduction to Stirner's thought. Afterwards, if you want a more nuanced take on the Hegelian question, look at 2018, The Radicalism of Departure. And then for older work that focuses more on the form and structure of Stirner's work, perhaps look at Max Stirner's Dialectical Egoism. In regard to my own projects, I am working on what's it called? I'm forgetting the term. A side-by-side English to German edition. To not only I'm going to be publishing that perhaps through Zero Books, but also be creating a new edition of the Uniqueness property because there are a couple of editorial and grammatical errors that ought to be corrected, and also because to help with annotations and further referencing in the book, and thus hopefully enabling greater reservation for those who are interested in perhaps continuing a translation for Stirner's work, if they so desire, or to be more informed on the German words, the German roots that Stirner is going to be speaking about, but also perhaps with the newly edited book to enable perhaps greater referentiality and an ease of reading that that these publishers didn't. The editors of these publishers didn't quite put forth the effort in doing so. After that, I have, of course, my own reading group that I have. As I said at the beginning, that 2 years ago, at the beginning of COVID, I started a reading group in which we would do live readings together of the Uniqueness Property, and that would last a year and a half. And so, if there is, I think I'm going to put it into the chat if there's anyone who's interested in joining the Discord that I have. You can join the Discord there. And I also have the same meeting on the meetup. I believe I'll also be putting on. Oh, pardon me. That it's on the service known as Meetup. I have a link to the same Zoom call that I have every Wednesday. I see that there's a couple of hands, and I recognize that I didn't look at any comments or hands raised. I hope that didn't hurt anyone's feelings here. And I understand also that this meeting takes place very early for some who live in Australia here. I don't know who was first between Stephen or George.
Well, let me thank you for Tim Jackson for your presentation on the secular anti-theism of Max Stirner.